For most people, one of the most popular national parks globally is the Yellowstone National Park. It is, in fact, the first national park in the world, which was about 20 years before Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana even became official US states. When the first visitors to Yellowstone tried to report what they saw, news magazines responded, "Thank you, but we do not print fiction." Their skepticism was easily justified because the features were simply too breathtaking to be true. Yellowstone has to be seen to be believed, from colorful hot springs to mud pots and majestic waterfalls. Nothing else on Earth is quite like Yellowstone, and there is something to excite everyone from children to grandparents. Established in 1872 and located primarily in Wyoming, Yellowstone remains one of the country's most popular national parks, with millions of annual visitors. Yellowstone spans almost 3,500 square miles and extends into parts of Montana and Idaho, making it one of the largest national parks in the US. Yellowstone National Park sits on top of a dormant supervolcano capable of a magnitude 8 eruption. Some parts of the park are just 3 miles above magma or molten rock. The park is also home to more geysers and hot springs than any other place on Earth. There are lots of wonders to take in at this truly unique national park, from sights like the Yellowstone Grand Canyon to wildlife like America's largest buffalo herd, grizzly bears, and wolves. Approximately 50% of the world's hydrothermal features are at Yellowstone National Park, creating an effect that makes the ground appear to be on fire. The most famous of all the geysers is Old Faithful, one of the most popular and recognized natural wonders in the United States. Yellowstone got its name from Native Americans who were referring to the yellow sandstone along the Yellowstone River. People tend to assume that Yellowstone got its name from the vivid yellow colors seen in the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. As it turns out, however, the park's moniker stems from the sandstone along the Yellowstone River in eastern Montana, which is actually several hundred miles downstream and northeast of the park. While the Yellowstone is a wonder to behold, there are some terrifying things about the national park. In fact, the first one we talk about is better imagined than experienced. Even imagining it can cause you to wince. The hot springs in Yellowstone are great to observe and even photograph with their vivid colors, but what happens when a visitor falls into one of them? Before we go on, let us establish it is a terrible idea to dive in for a swim in any of the hot springs. We are only looking at how bad an idea it is. This particular volcanic caldera sits atop one of the largest magma bodies in the world, fueled by an upwelling plume of superheated material. This dynamic and violent subterranean plumbing means that the water bodies at the surface, including the many geysers and springs, tend to be highly acidic, incredibly hot, and deadly to animal life. Back in 2016, an unfortunate individual decided to ignore the numerous warnings plastered around the park and dip his finger into one of the Yellowstone's plentiful hot springs. Wrong move, but not only did he fall in and die, but he completely dissolved within 24 hours. While we can assure you it was a terrible way to go, what exactly happened to his body when he tumbled into the water? The first thing was his body felt like he was bathing in waters around 93 degrees Celsius or 199 degrees Fahrenheit. It would hurt like nothing you can possibly imagine, but only for as long as his nervous system could register pain, which fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, won't be more than a minute or so. At this temperature, the late visitor's skin, the epidermis, quickly broke down and began to disintegrate. His blood vessels within his underlying dermis would rupture soon afterward, causing rapid blood loss. Some underlying skin layers, instead of breaking down, lost all their water and became leathery and blackened. His underlying subcutaneous fat would soon bubble off too. All this, known as a full-thickness burn, happened in less than a minute. His nervous system entered a state of shock and became irreversibly damaged. At this point, his organs had started to fail, although the extreme heat stress would have already shut down some of them in the first place. With death occurring in 2 to 3 minutes, the acidity of the water then takes over completely. Some of the hot springs actually have mildly alkaline waters, but many, including Norris Geyser Basin, the one the visitor fell into, are incredibly acidic with pH values of around 2. The lower the value, the more acidic it gets. With such high acidity levels and at such high temperatures, even the skeleton doesn't stand a chance. Within just a few hours inside the water, the visitor was gone, dissolved into nothing. The next discovery in the Yellowstone National Park is literally out of this world. It can actually help in the search for life on Mars. Researchers say a bizarre group of microbes found living inside rocks in an inhospitable geothermal environment at Wyoming's Yellowstone National Park could provide tantalizing new clues about ancient life on Earth and help steer the hunt for evidence of life on Mars. University of Colorado at Boulder, CU Boulder, scientists Jeffrey Walker, John Spear, and Norman Pace reported their findings in research funded by the National Science Foundation's Division of Environmental Biology and NASA. The CU Boulder research team reported that the microbes were discovered in the pores of rocks in a highly acidic environment with high concentrations of metals and silicates at roughly 95 degrees Fahrenheit in Yellowstone's Norris Geyser Basin. The new study shows that the microbe communities are subject to fossilization and have the potential to become preserved in the geologic record. Scientists believe similar geothermal environments may once have existed on Mars, where astrobiologists have intensified the search for past and present life forms in recent years. This is the first description of these microbial communities, which may be a good diagnostic indicator of past life on Mars because of their potential for fossil preservation. The prevalence of this type of microbial life in Yellowstone means that Martian rocks associated with former hydrothermal systems may be the best hope for finding evidence of past life there. Located about 20 miles northwest of Yellowstone Lake, Norris Geyser Basin is considered the hottest and most active geyser basin in Yellowstone and perhaps the world. It also is highly acidic, according to the researchers. The pores in the rocks where these creatures live have a pH value of 1, which dissolves nails. It's another example that life can be robust in an environment most humans view as inhospitable. Did you know that while Yellowstone Park is large, the ecosystem is actually shrinking? What exactly does that mean for the beloved national park? The boundaries of Yellowstone have not changed much, although they were slightly revised by President Herbert Hoover. What is really changing is the wild natural habitat available in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, an area 10 times larger than the park itself. It has been shrinking alarmingly and is now constituting a problem for the numerous animals that frequently cross park borders. In a study published by Montana State University ecologist Andrew Hansen and Linda Phillips, the two scientists found that since 1970, the ecosystem's human population has doubled and housing density has tripled. Worryingly, both are expected to double again by 2050, causing even more ecological trouble. It is sad that human development now covers an estimated 31% of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. As Hansen put it, rural homes more or less ring the public land on all sides of the park. It's rather stunning to me to look at a map of all the homes that now surround the park, and changes in these private lands surrounding the park really influence what happens in the park. Many animals like elk, bison, and pronghorn spend the summer in the park, but in winter proceed to lower elevations, where they increasingly find themselves on developed private lands, where they aren't always welcome and are usually hunted down. Other ranging animals, like grizzlies, get into trouble as a result of their interaction with humans. Their population reduces as they get killed on roads, for example. Roads are especially a problem because they are dangerous and prevent the animals from traveling from one part of the ecosystem to another for survival. Yellowstone is also facing problematic species encroaching on its territories. For example, invasive grasses and plants spread towards the park from horse and livestock grazing. Non-native species like the eastern smallmouth bass, which poses a grave threat to the park's iconic trout populations, have been recently caught just outside of the park boundaries. The large number of people that visit Yellowstone is also taking its toll. More than 4 million explore the park each year, and they affect animal feed trails, resting places, and even mating. And thanks to scientists, Yellowstone has actually brought back an animal, the bison. By the time the park was established, the continent no longer had bison herds. They had been hunted down so much that their population had dwindled seriously. Their foraging area had also shrunk thanks to prolonged dry years. In fact, by the 1880s, only about 20 bison remained in the park. However, these days there are up to 5,500 bison in Yellowstone, and they are thriving. In fact, for population control, several Native American tribes and the state of Montana sponsor limited bison hunts near the border. Park officials also trap bison at the northern border, sending some to the slaughter while transferring others to populate new areas. The presence of bison is a win for Yellowstone in more ways than one. As they graze and drop excrement, they fuel a cycle of nutrient-rich soils and plants. When bison munch on the tops of grasses, they stimulate new plant growth, producing more of the productive foods that they and other herbivores rely on. In this way, the bison engineer the ecosystem in Yellowstone. Below the picturesque geysers and rainbow-tinted hot springs of Yellowstone National Park lurks one of the most destructive volcanoes on Earth. The gargantuan Yellowstone hotspot, also known as the Yellowstone supervolcano, has erupted at least 10 times over the past 16 million years, permanently altering the geography of North America. However, its effects were not limited to North America, as it periodically warped Earth's climate, throwing flakes of airborne ash to every corner of the world. According to the scientists, the new discovery rewrites the hotspot's ancient history. The largest, most cataclysmic of these eruptions are called supereruptions. These earth-shuddering blasts measure 8 or higher on the Volcanic Explosivity Index (VEI), which measures a volcano's relative explosivity by the height of its ash column and the volume of its leftover lava. For context, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens measured 5 on the VEI. However, because the scale is logarithmic, a level 8 supereruption is about 1,000 times more explosive than that. The second eruption, called the Gray's Landing supereruption, occurred 8.72 million years ago and was colossal. This eruption covered roughly 8,900 square miles, or 23,000 square kilometers, of what is now southern Idaho and northern Nevada, making it the single largest eruption of the Yellowstone hotspot ever detected. Sadly, not everybody that visited Yellowstone made it out alive or in good health. Since 1979, more than 118 million people have visited Yellowstone, and 44 out of these visitors were injured by grizzly bears. However, you need not fear, because your chances of being attacked by a grizzly bear are about 1 in 2.7 million visits. You can even lower the risk significantly by sticking to developed areas or roadside. But if hiking in the backcountry is your thing, know that a surprise appearance by a grizzly may be part of the deal. If you're camping, there has been one bear attack for every 26.6 million overnight stays on the campgrounds. If you would rather camp in the backcountry, the risk increases significantly to 1 in 1.7 million overnight stays, so the choice is yours. Since Yellowstone opened as a park, grizzly bears have killed a total of 8 people. While it is sad, the number is lower than other incidents. For example, 121 people have died from drowning, while 21 people have fallen into the hot springs. 26 people took their own lives, while falling trees killed 7 people. Avalanches have killed 6 people, while lightning has taken the lives of 5 visitors. Now, something has been happening to the Old Faithful, and all seems not to be well with this landmark. The Old Faithful, one of the biggest draws of Yellowstone, is not so faithful. In fact, it might shut down altogether. Old Faithful is slowing down, lamented Rick Hutchinson, who has been studying the park's leading tourist attraction since 1970. He added, "One day it might just quit permanently. In 1970, when I got here, the average interval was 66 minutes, Mr. Hutchinson said in the 90s. Today, it is 77 minutes. In the 1970s, it was more regular. Our forecast had a margin of plus or minus 5 minutes. Now it's plus or minus 10 minutes. The interval has expanded significantly now." The geysers' reputation for reliability goes back at least 150 years, when members of an expedition led by Surveyor General of Montana Henry Washburn and Montana politician and businessman Nathaniel Langford first dubbed it Old Faithful. The geologist Ferdinand Hayden, who led a subsequent scientific expedition in 1871, wrote of Old Faithful, "It has been called the guardian of the valley. It is so regular in its operations and they occur so frequently that it has afforded unusual facilities for observation." Yet many of Old Faithful's visitors may not realize the precise balance of heat and water required to keep the geyser regularly ejecting a fountain of hot water and steam from its intricate underground plumbing. So what is the problem with Old Faithful? Well, the geyser has gone dormant before, hundreds of years ago, most likely due to the water part of the equation being thrown out of whack. The geyser stopped erupting toward the end of the so-called medieval climate anomaly, when many locations around the world experienced prolonged periods of warm, dry weather. It's the time when we have things like grapes growing in northern England and a loss of sea ice that allowed people to discover Greenland, said Kathy Whitlock, a paleoclimatologist at Montana State University in Bozeman. We know in Yellowstone it was both warmer and drier. The upper tree line was higher up the slopes, and there is evidence of more fires during that period. Steam flows were also lower, she added. Extreme droughts in the region lasted for decades. Researchers have also found that earthquake-caused changes in the ground can alter geysers' eruption intervals. This is likely one of the main reasons Old Faithful now erupts on average every 94 minutes, compared to around 60 to 65 minutes in the 1950s. However, researchers found no evidence of significant earthquake activity around the time of Old Faithful's dormant period, so they concluded the dry climate probably caused the hiatus. Yellowstone region is again experiencing droughts, this time most likely linked to human-caused global warming. In 2008, a group of scientists published a paper showing that years with lower precipitation at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century had likely added a minute or two to Old Faithful's eruption cycle. It is possible the geyser could shut down completely if the climate continues to dry. Did we talk about Yellowstone erupting again? While that is scary, the discovery gets even more frightening when you go below the ground at the Yellowstone National Park. Meanwhile, the discovery gets even more frightening when you go below the ground at the Yellowstone National Park. Buried under your feet is a gargantuan magma reservoir containing hot sponge-like rock and some molten rock that dwarfs a previously known magma chamber. The findings revealed the chamber holds enough scalding hot magma to fill the Grand Canyon over 11 times. Scientists discovered the chamber while mapping the underground plumbing system below the supervolcano. Hee-Sin Huang, the study author and seismologist at the University of Utah, said for the first time, scientists have imaged the continuous volcanic plumbing system under Yellowstone. That includes the upper crustal magma chamber we have seen previously, plus a lower crustal magma reservoir that has never been imaged before, and that connects the upper chamber to the Yellowstone hotspot plume below. The discovery is what geophysicist Peter Cavelli describes as the missing link between the plume and magma chamber. If an eruption was to happen, the giant magma chamber would intensify the event, leading to more destruction and reaching more distant parts of the planet. Luckily, you don't have to worry, because the chances of an incident occurring are 1 in 700,000. Speaking of eruptions and other disturbances, if you plan to visit Yellowstone to take in the splendor of Old Faithful before it dries up, remember to prepare for earthquakes. In fact, lots of them. This is because on a typical day, the national park experiences multiple earthquakes. This is hardly surprising since the Yellowstone area is seismically active, but how frequently do earthquakes occur in the park? Over the long term, Yellowstone averages between 1,500 and 2,000 earthquakes per year. Let's look at data from the last decade, from 2010 to 2019, to understand this average better. During these 3,652 days, the University of Utah seismograph stations UUSS located 17,243 earthquakes in the Yellowstone region. This gives an average daily number of earthquakes of 4.7, or one earthquake every 5.1 hours. However, since about half of these events occur in swarms, they are not evenly distributed over time. As a comparison, over the last decade, UUSS located 14,080 earthquakes in the Utah region for an average of 3.9 earthquakes per day, or an earthquake every 6.2 hours. The truth, however, is that scientists are not even locating every earthquake that happens in Yellowstone, or anywhere for that matter. The ability to record and find an earthquake is directly related to the number and distribution of seismometers in the region, the seismic network. When an earthquake happens, seismic energy propagates out in all directions, but that energy lessens as it travels away from the source. To get a location and an origin time for an earthquake, you need to record that earthquake on at least 4 stations. As a result, it is hard to record and locate very small earthquakes if you don't have a dense seismic array, because you can't adequately record small earthquakes on enough stations. The energy from such small quakes dissipates too rapidly to be recorded across the seismic network. The largest quake of the past several years was a magnitude 4.8 that occurred near Norris Geyser Basin in March 2014, and that was felt widely across the area. Did you know the Yellowstone is literally saving lives? Let's take you on a short trip down the COVID-19 memory lane for the next discovery and see how a key ingredient of COVID testing material came from the national park. It all started when microbiologist Thomas Brock was tramping through Yellowstone in the 1960s and stumbled upon a species of bacteria that would transform medical science. Brock was investigating the tiny life forms that managed to eke out a living in the superheated waters of the park's thermal pools. There, he and a student found golden mats of stringy growth in Yellowstone's mushroom spring, containing a microbe that produces unusual heat-resistant enzymes. Today, those enzymes are a key component in polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, a method used widely in labs worldwide to study small samples of genetic material by making millions of copies. This technique, which would have been impossible without the discovery of heat-resistant bacteria more than half a century ago, is now being used to boost the signal of viruses in most of the available tests for COVID-19. As the novel coronavirus sweeps worldwide, testing has become the crux of tracking the pandemic's advance. While authorities were slow in making COVID-19 tests widely available, the PCR process that is the vital backbone of the test is relatively simple and quick, thanks to a cluster of bacteria thriving in the thermal pools of Yellowstone. In the 1980s, American biochemist Kary Mullis developed a technique to mimic the way a cell naturally copies its DNA to grow and divide. A set of primers or short segments of DNA mark the regions targeted for copying. An enzyme known as DNA polymerase then assembles the basic building blocks of DNA into the desired sequence. The DNA has to be heated and then cooled in a cycle again and again, each time roughly doubling the number of genetic copies. But in early experiments, the high temperatures of each cycle damaged the DNA polymerase needed to make those copies. Mullis realized that an enzyme from the Yellowstone bacteria could survive the heating and cooling cycles and speed up the process. Over the years, these enzymes have allowed scientists to automate the DNA copying process. Now researchers can produce hundreds of millions of genetic copies in hours. The COVID-19 test uses this same process, but with a few additional steps. The genetic material of the novel coronavirus is RNA rather than DNA, which is similar but encodes its genetic instructions with different building blocks in just a single strand. The RNA of the virus is converted to DNA first. The test also includes a fluorescent tag highlighting copies of the virus's genetic material in a nasal swab. The more copies that are made with PCR, the brighter the sample. One other amazing fact is how the humble wolf has changed the eco-balance of Yellowstone in so short a time. To illustrate, before wolves were introduced, there was only one beaver colony, but there are now more than 9, with the promise of even more. How did a single animal come to be so important to the well-being of the whole park? To answer that, you have to go back to the 1930s when the wolf was killed off entirely in Yellowstone. With what repercussion? The ecosystem was thrown out of balance. For example, even though Yellowstone elk were still preyed upon by black and grizzly bears, cougars, and to a lesser extent coyotes, the absence of wolves took a huge amount of predatory pressure off the elk. This caused the population of elks to explode. 2 things happened. The elk pushed the limits of Yellowstone's carrying capacity, and because they didn't move around much in the winter, they munched heavily on the young willow, aspen, and cottonwood plants. That was tough luck for beaver, who need willows to survive in winter. But things are different with the return of the wolves. How? In 1968, with the elk population a third of what it is today, the willow plants along streams had a tough time surviving. However, today, with much more elks around, the willow stands are thriving. That seems counterintuitive until you account for the presence of the wolves. They have basically kept the elks on their toes by hunting them. Because of the predatory pressure, the elks are now on the move and have little time for consuming the willow stands. This leaves enough food for the beavers, and they are flourishing again. And as the beavers spread and do their little beaver business by building new dams and ponds, the cascade effect continued. These cute beaver dams have multiple effects on stream hydrology. They even out the seasonal pulses of runoff, store water for recharging the water table, and provide cold, shaded water for fish, while the now robust willow stands to provide habitat for songbirds. The return of wolves benefits other animals as well. For example, instead of a boom and bust cycle of elk carrion availability, which occurred in the absence of the wolves, there's now a more equitable distribution of carrion throughout winter and early spring. Scavengers that once relied on winter-killed elk for food now depend on wolf-killed elk. That benefits ravens, eagles, magpies, coyotes, and bears, especially as the bears emerge hungry from hibernation. Would you love to visit the Yellowstone National Park?